The morning fog still clung to the valleys of southern Italy when the first engines of the B-25 Mitchells began to roar to life. It was early 1944, and the airfields scattered across Corsica and the southern peninsula felt more like crowded anthills than military bases. Mechanics hurried between parked aircraft, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, and wiping dust from the long glazed noses of the medium bombers. Every man on the flight line knew what kind of mission was coming. It was the kind that stretched nerves thin, the kind that demanded more skill than luck, the kind where altitude was measured not in thousands of feet, but in meters, the kind where the ground looked too close to be real. Lieutenant Jack Renner stood beneath the wing of his B-25, staring at the silhouette of the aircraft as the rising sun turned the sky into a pale wash of orange. The bomber looked rugged and muscular, its twin engines gleaming with a cold metallic shine. This was not the high-altitude giant of the heavy bomber groups. This was something else, a brawler of the sky, a knife fighter built for speed, precision, and brutality. To the crews of the 12th and 15th Air Force, the B-25 was more than a bomber. It was a partner in survival, a machine that obeyed every command instantly, whether rolling down a canyon wall or whipping past a line of soldiers dug into a hillside. Its wings were short and strong, perfect for low-altitude maneuvering. Its engines, the Wright R-2600 twin Cyclones, were powerful enough to drag the bomber out of a dive even when one was coughing black smoke. And its nose bristled with a wall of 50 caliber guns that could tear through a train car like it was made of cardboard. But none of those things defined the B-25 in the Italian campaign. What defined it was height, or rather, the lack of it. Renner climbed the ladder into the cockpit. The interior smelled of oil, warm metal, and the faint hint of gunpowder left over from yesterday's mission. The pilot's seat felt familiar beneath him, molded by long hours of flight. Beside him, his co-pilot, Lieutenant Harris, settled in with a slow exhale. "Another low run," Harris said quietly. "I can already feel my stomach dropping." Renner smiled without humor. "Better get used to it. They are sending us lower every week." It was true. The front lines in Italy had hardened into a brutal series of defensive belts. Hills, rivers, heavily fortified towns, and deep valleys created natural choke points. The Germans placed artillery everywhere they could find. The morning fog still clung to the valleys of southern Italy when the first engines of the B-25 Mitchells began to roar to life. It was early 1944, and the airfields scattered across Corsica and the southern peninsula felt more like crowded anthills than military bases. Mechanics hurried between parked aircraft, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, and wiping dust from the long glazed noses of the medium bombers. Every man on the flight line knew what kind of mission was coming. It was the kind that stretched nerves thin, the kind that demanded more skill than luck, the kind where altitude was measured not in thousands of feet, but in meters, the kind where the ground looked too close to be real. Lieutenant Jack Renner stood beneath the wing of his B-25, staring at the silhouette of the aircraft as the rising sun turned the sky into a pale wash of orange. The bomber looked rugged and muscular, its twin engines gleaming with a cold metallic shine. This was not the high-altitude giant of the heavy bomber groups. This was something else, a brawler of the sky, a knife fighter built for speed, precision, and brutality. To the crews of the 12th and 15th Air Force, the B-25 was more than a bomber. It was a partner in survival, a machine that obeyed every command instantly, whether rolling down a canyon wall or whipping past a line of soldiers dug into a hillside. Its wings were short and strong, perfect for low-altitude maneuvering. Its engines, the Wright R-2600 twin Cyclones, were powerful enough to drag the bomber out of a dive even when one was coughing black smoke. And its nose bristled with a wall of 50 caliber guns that could tear through a train car like it was made of cardboard. But none of those things defined the B-25 in the Italian campaign. What defined it was height, or rather, the lack of it. Renner climbed the ladder into the cockpit. The interior smelled of oil, warm metal, and the faint hint of gunpowder left over from yesterday's mission. The pilot seat felt familiar beneath him, molded by long hours of flight. Beside him, his co-pilot, Lieutenant Harris, settled in with a slow exhale. "Another low run, Harris," said quietly. "I can already feel my stomach dropping." Renner smiled without humor. "Better get used to it. They're sending us lower every week." It was true. The front lines in Italy had hardened into a brutal series of defensive belts. Hills, rivers, heavily fortified towns, and deep valleys created natural choke points. The Germans placed artillery everywhere they could find a commanding view. Bridges were mined, rail lines were critical, and the enemy supply columns moved under the cover of thick forests or hugging the cliff sides. Traditional bombing from high altitude did little. The mountains swallowed the craters. The valleys hid the targets. The Germans learned to survive the rain of bombs. So the Americans changed the rules. They sent in the B-25s, not from 10,000 feet, not even from 1,000 feet, but from 50 feet, sometimes lower. Flying low meant speed. Flying low meant surprise. Flying low meant threading a needle at 300 miles per hour, knowing that one mistake, one misjudged shadow or rising hill could tear the aircraft apart. Renner pulled his oxygen mask aside and looked out the cockpit window. Beyond the runway, rows of olive trees lined the fields. A thin mist hung above them, drifting like a pale veil. The mountains of the Apennine Range rose in the distance. Beautiful? Yes. Deadly? Absolutely. The crew finished their checks. The engines revved higher, the sound vibrating through the entire airframe. The bomber rolled forward, its tires bumping across the uneven stones of the old Italian airstrip. Harris leaned forward. "This is the part I hate. The quiet right before the noise." But as soon as the throttles hit full power, there was nothing quiet left. The engines roared, spraying dust behind them. The bomber surged down the runway. Renner felt the weight of the aircraft grow lighter, the wheels bump less, the nose lift slightly. Then, they were airborne. They did not climb high. They leveled off just above the treetops, the blades of tall grass bending in the wind beneath them. The morning haze rushed past the canopy in streaks. The ground looked close enough to touch. Renner kept the nose low. The formation of B-25s followed the contours of the land, rising barely enough to clear ridges, dropping into valleys, sliding between hillsides like water flowing through a channel. Within minutes, they reached the mainland, and immediately they felt the war waiting for them. German troops scattered along the ridgelines often described the first time they saw the American medium bombers. They expected high-altitude raids, bombs falling from the sky like distant thunder. They expected time to prepare, to track the formations, to calculate the intercept. Instead, the B-25s came at them like predatory birds sweeping down the length of a canyon. Low enough that soldiers could see the glint in the pilot's eyes. Low enough that the propeller wash whipped dust and loose helmets from the ground. Low enough that the barrels of German rifles could not point down far enough to track them. Renner dipped his wings slightly as they approached the first valley. The bomber slid down the slope so close that branches of pine trees brushed against the underside of the fuselage. The engines roared in the confined space, echoing off the rocky walls. The navigator called out, "Bridge in 2 minutes. Enemy flak expected." Renner did not answer. His hands tightened around the yoke. The terrain rushed beneath them.
The river appeared ahead, thin and winding, and spanning it, a narrow stone bridge the Germans relied on for moving artillery toward the front. This was one of the reasons the B-25 existed, to strike the exact spots that the enemy believed were untouchable. They approached the bridge at a speed that made the air ripple around the nose. German flak crews scrambled into position, but their guns were built for aircraft high above them, not for something bearing down on them at eye level. A German soldier later wrote in his diary, "They flew so low I could see the pilot looking back at me. I thought I could reach up and touch the plane." Renner lined up the target. His bombardier braced himself. The valley walls lit up with tracer fire. Machine guns raked the air above the bomber, missing by mere inches. Bombs away! The bomber jumped as the payload released. Explosions tore across the stone bridge, sending debris into the river below. Renner yanked the bomber upward just enough to clear a rising hill on the far side.
The B-25 formation skimmed over the rolling fields of central Italy as if the aircraft were not machines but living creatures hugging the earth for survival. The early haze had lifted, revealing valleys carved like giant scars through the Apennine Mountains. Lieutenant Jack Renner adjusted the trim with small, precise motions, each correction keeping the bomber only a dozen meters above the tops of the olive trees below. Low-level flying was unlike any other form of combat aviation. At altitude, the sky was a wide-open realm. There was margin for error, space to breathe, time to think. But down here, flying barely above the surface, the sky was a narrow corridor lined with lethal walls. One misjudged hill, one rise in terrain, one late reaction. That was all it took for a bomber to smear itself across the landscape. In the cockpit, Harris kept both hands braced on the sides of the window. "I swear, Jack, every time we fly this low, I feel like I am falling into the ground." "You will get used to it," Renner said. "No, I will not." Renner did not argue. Nobody ever really got used to low-level flight. They learned to control the fear, to bury it beneath skill and repetition. But the instinct to pull up never fully disappeared. Behind them, the bombardier peered through the greenhouse nose, adjusting his sight lines. "Bridge at Orte is still our primary target," he called. "Expect heavy fire." Renner acknowledged him with a nod, but kept his eyes forward. The terrain was already tightening into a narrow valley. The sides rose steeply, covered with clusters of pine trees and terraces carved for farmland. The bomber fit inside the valley like a bullet inside a barrel. The noise of the engines reverberated off stone cliffs, creating a strange effect. The sound hit them from all sides, making it feel as if the bomber was flying inside a giant drum. It added to the tension, pressing into their ears like a second heartbeat. Harris pointed out the window. "Look at that, flak towers on the ridge." Indeed, German crews had built small sandbagged emplacements along the slopes. They were low-caliber guns, but deadly at this altitude. A cannon shell from below would tear into the belly of a B-25 with terrifying ease. Harris tightened his grip. "Stay steady. We will pass beneath their arc." The bomber hugged the valley floor, slipping beneath the line of fire by meters. When the Germans opened up, their tracers streaked overhead instead of into the fuselage. Harris let out a tight breath he had been holding. "This is insane." That was the nature of low-level bombing. It traded altitude for survival, danger for surprise. The Germans expected bombers from above, not from the deck. Their guns were aimed skyward. Their radars struggled to read the terrain. Their crews often reacted too late. And when they reacted on time, the B-25s were already past them. Renner's radio operator leaned forward. "Command says German troops in the region have begun describing us in their reports. They call the B-25 the ground scraper. Renner smirked. Could be worse. A voice from the tail gunner came through the intercom. I saw a farmer look up at us like we were breaking into his house. Renner kept them focused. Heads up, power lines ahead. The valley widened briefly before narrowing again toward a set of stone houses on a ridge. Between two slopes stretched a line of electrical cables. They were thin, almost invisible at high speed, but hitting one would shear a wing clean off. Renner pushed the nose down a fraction. The bomber dropped, slipping beneath the wires so close that the shadow of the cables flicked across the cockpit like a whip. The top turret gunner let out a long whistle. I think those wires just parted my hair. Renner rolled the bomber slightly to follow the terrain. The ground rose again, meeting the aircraft halfway. Trees whipped past so quickly they appeared as green blurs. The smell of earth, mixed with engine exhaust, drifted into the cockpit. The navigator called out again. Enemy rail line ahead, curving into Foligno. Expect troop trains. That meant one thing. Guns forward. Renner flicked a switch. The dozen .5 caliber guns in the nose came alive with a heavy metallic crack. The entire aircraft vibrated under the chatter of the machine guns. Harris watched the ground. Where are they? Wait for it, Renner whispered. Then he saw them. A column of German rail cars snaking along the track, smoke pouring from the locomotive. Troops were visible on the car roofs manning makeshift machine gun positions. Renner dropped the nose. The train filled the nose view. Men shouted on the ground, scrambling for cover. The B-25 roared over the rails, guns ripping through the transport cars. Sparks erupted as bullets smacked into steel. The locomotive burst into flame, steam exploding upward in a violent plume. The concussion rattled the bomber as they passed barely meters above the wreckage. Behind them, the tail gunner shouted, "They are scattering like ants down there." Renner climbed slightly, just enough to clear a rising hill. The bomber shook as the left wing clipped the top of a tree, snapping branches into the air. Harris swallowed hard. That was too close. Renner replied under his breath, "Close is what low-level flying is." They leveled out again as they neared another valley. The terrain ahead opened into a wider field scattered with German positions, trucks, light flak guns, infantry, all visible at eye level. The Germans couldn't believe what they were seeing. Bomber aircraft screaming past them like charging bulls, not above them, not beyond reach, but right in their faces. Some soldiers fired rifles straight upward. Others dove into trenches. A few simply froze, staring at the pilots of the B-25s as if unable to comprehend how a bomber could fly lower than the trees. A German gunner later told a captured American that the B-25s came so low he could see the wrinkles on the pilot's forehead. Renner banked to the right, turning into another canyon. "This is it," he said. "Last valley before Orte." The crew braced themselves. The margin for error was gone. If the Germans wanted to stop them, this was their chance. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the approach to the bridge. Machine gun nests dotted the hillside. The B-25s had to go under them, through them, or straight past them. This was the art of low-level bombing. The cliff walls rose. The valley tightened. The ground rushed by like a living thing. Renner steadied the bomber. There was no going higher. There was only going through. The valley narrowed as Lieutenant Jack Renner guided the B-25 deeper into the Apennine Mountains. The air around the bomber felt compressed, almost solid. The walls of stone were so close that the echo of the engines ricocheted between them like cannon fire in a granite canyon. The crew inside felt every vibration, every shift of air, every heartbeat of the engines. The tension in the cockpit was almost physical. Harris leaned forward, eyes wide as he watched the rising ridgeline ahead. "I feel like we are flying through a tunnel," he muttered. Renner did not respond. His entire focus was locked on the next ridge, the next curve of the terrain, the next shadow that might hide enemy guns. Low-level flying left no room for distraction. It demanded instinct, sharpened by fear, skill refined by repetition, and courage held together by discipline. The B-25 climbed just enough to clear the ridge. As they crested the hill, the valley opened into a wide, green expanse that stretched toward the distant town of Orte. From their altitude, the landscape looked close enough to touch. Small farms dotted the slopes. A thin river wound through the valley floor. Smoke rose from chimneys in scattered villages. But there was something else, too. Movement. German trucks rumbling along dirt roads, horse-drawn wagons carrying ammunition, troops sprinting toward defensive positions, railway lines bending around the hillsides leading toward Rome. This valley was a lifeline for the German army, and today, the B-25s had come to cut it. The radio crackled with the voice of the group leader. Targets confirmed. Bridges and transport along the Orte rail line. All units proceed. Renner dipped the nose and followed the group leader into the valley. Ahead of them, the first wave of B-25s fired their guns, long streams of tracers carving glowing lines through the air. German positions erupted as bullets struck sandbags and gun shields. The explosions echoed off the mountains. The German defenders responded immediately. Light flak guns opened fire, filling the valley with bursts of black smoke. Tracer fire streaked toward the approaching bombers. The guns on the ground tracked as quickly as they could, but the B-25s were coming in too fast, too low, too suddenly. Renner felt the bomber shake as rounds cracked past the fuselage. "Stay low! Stay low!" He pushed the throttle forward. The engines roared even louder. The bomber descended until the treetops whipped past them. A gust of wind rocked the aircraft, forcing Renner to fight for control. Flying low meant feeling every ripple in the air, every thermal rising off the hillside, every shift in wind direction. Harris shouted over the noise, "Bridge ahead! Bridge ahead!" There it was. The stone bridge at Orte, stretching across the narrow river. German troops rushed along both ends of it, setting up machine guns and hauling ammunition crates. Trucks crawled across its surface, trying to get out of the kill zone. Renner leveled the bomber and held it steady. "Bombardier, stand by." The bombardier crouched in the nose, one hand on the release switch. On the ground, German soldiers scrambled for cover. One gunner operated a flat gun positioned at the far end of the bridge, trying to angle his barrel low enough to fire directly into the incoming bomber. But the arc of his gun was designed for targets higher in the sky. He could not push it low enough. That was the fatal flaw of German defenses. They were built to fight bombers above them, not bombers at eye level. The B-25 roared across the valley, closing the distance in seconds. "Bombs away!" The bomber leapt upward as the payload dropped. A second later, the earth beneath the bridge exploded. Stones shattered in every direction. The structure buckled, twisted, then collapsed into the river with a violent crash that threw water into the air like a fountain. Harris pumped his fist. Direct hit! But there was no time to celebrate. German machine gun fire ripped toward them from the hillside. Renner yanked the controls, banking left so hard that the bomber shuddered. The wingtip passed so close to a cluster of trees that branches snapped off in the slipstream. The intercom erupted. "Right turret here! Incoming fire from the farm complex!" Renner glanced down. A group of German soldiers had set up defensive positions along a stone farmhouse and orchard. As the bomber passed overhead, they fired everything they had. Tracers flew upward, smacking into the underside of the aircraft. The waist gunner fired back, shredding the orchard with bursts of .50 caliber fire. Splinters burst from tree trunks, dirt kicked up in violent sprays. German soldiers dove behind a stone wall. Renner pulled the bomber back toward the river valley. His breathing was heavy, but his eyes were locked on the next target zone.
"We are not done yet," he said. "Rail yard ahead." The navigator confirmed it. "Train moving southbound, loaded with cargo." Renner grinned slightly. "Not for long." He lined up the bomber with the railway line. Smoke rose from the locomotive as it pulled a long line of cars filled with fuel, ammunition, and supplies. German soldiers leaned from the cars, shooting rifles upward in desperation. The B-25 closed in. "Nose guns, full burst!" The forward guns roared to life, vibrating the entire fuselage. The bullets slammed into the train, sparking off metal. An ammunition car erupted in an explosion that blew debris into the sky. The locomotive lurched sideways, wheels leaving the tracks, as steam burst from the torn boiler. Harris shielded his eyes. "That is going to burn for days." Renner pulled hard on the yoke, lifting the bomber over a small ridge. The valley behind them was filled with columns of smoke. Bridges shattered, rail lines torn apart, trains burning, and German troops scrambling for cover. But the mission was not free of cost. Behind them, another B-25 took a direct hit from a flat gun hidden in a grove of trees. The shell tore through the left engine. The bomber caught fire instantly, spiraling downward. The crew fought to control it, but the flames spread too fast. Renner watched helplessly as the aircraft crashed into the valley floor. He closed his eyes briefly. We knew this was coming. Low-level missions were deadly by nature. There was no margin for error, no altitude to trade for time. Every enemy gun had a direct line of sight. Every mission came with the possibility that a plane would not return. But they flew anyway, because the bridges had to fall, the rail lines had to break, the German supplies had to stop. And no other aircraft could deliver that destruction with such precision. Renner steadied the bomber as they prepared to exit the valley. The mission in Orte was done, but the war in Italy was not, and the B-25 would be needed again. Lower, faster, closer, because only the Mitchell could fly where others feared to go.
Smoke still curled upward from the shattered bridge at Orte as Lieutenant Jack Renner and his crew flew north along the valley, the B-25 vibrating from the strain of low-altitude maneuvering. The mission had already pushed them close to the limit, but the day was far from over. Their orders included more targets scattered across the Italian countryside. Every valley, road, and ridge seemed alive with German troops preparing for another fight. Renner steadied the bomber as they crossed the next ridge. Immediately, the world below erupted into chaos. German machine gun teams scattered across the hillside tried to track the formation with frantic movements. Soldiers ran to their weapons, shouting as the engines of the incoming B-25s echoed across the valley. The voice from the top turret crackled through the intercom. "Multiple positions on the right. They are scrambling everywhere." Harris leaned forward. "They did not expect us so soon." They did not expect them at all. Not like this. Not this low. Not this fast. The German High Command had spent years training their troops to fight American heavy bombers coming from high altitude. Their flak batteries were designed for steep angles. Their spotters watched the sky, not the treetops. Their manuals dictated engagement strategies for aircraft at thousands of feet. But nothing in German training prepared them for bombers that swept in below the tree line. The B-25s did not descend from the sky. They erupted from the horizon, and the effect on the soldiers on the ground was immediate. A group of German infantry near the small town of Attiliano found themselves directly in the path of the incoming formation. One soldier later wrote in his journal, "They flew so low I could see the whites of the pilot's eyes. I felt the wind from their engines on my helmet." Renner banked left, hugging the curve of the hillside. He spotted a cluster of flak guns camouflaged beside an orchard. The barrels jerked upward, trying desperately to track the bomber. But the Mitchells were too low. The guns were forced to aim downward at extreme angles. The gunners on the ground hesitated. Confusion rippled across their positions. A second later, panic swept in. The B-25s unleashed their forward guns. 12.5 caliber machine guns fired in synchronized bursts, tearing through the orchard. Splinters flew. Sandbags burst open. One flat gun toppled backward as its crew dove for cover. The waist gunner shouted, "They are scattering. They do not know where to aim." German soldiers scrambled across the field, stumbling over each other as they sought shelter. Some tried firing rifles upward, bullets snapping harmlessly against the armored belly of the bomber. Others simply froze, staring in disbelief as the Mitchell roared over them like a metal beast scraping the earth. Renner held the bomber steady, feeling the pressure of the air against the wings. A gust from the valley floor pushed them slightly off-center, forcing him to correct instantly. The sensation of flying so close to the ground never softened. The line between control and catastrophe was razor-thin. Harris glanced to his right. "Jack, look at that. They're running for the woods." A cluster of German troops sprinted across an open field toward a pine forest. Renner adjusted course slightly so the tail gunner could line up. The .5 calibers barked again, sending rounds into the ground behind the fleeing soldiers. The troops dove into the trees, thankful for any cover at all. The intercom buzzed again. "Tail here. There's a battery on the far ridge. They're setting up quick." Renner lowered the nose just enough to drop behind a line of tall poplars. The B-25s skimmed past them, branches whipping in the slipstream. The German battery on the ridge opened fire, but their shots sailed too high. They were accustomed to aiming where bombers usually flew, not where these demons of the sky now operated. A German officer watching the attack later wrote, "These aircraft did not fly over us, they flew through us." Renner's formation climbed briefly to clear another ridge before plunging into a narrow defile carved by centuries of rainwater. Shadows engulfed the bomber as the high walls blocked the sun. The engines thundered inside the confined space, shaking loose stones from the hillside. Harris stared ahead, his knuckles white on the window frame. "Feels like we are inside a canyon built to kill us." Renner kept his voice steady. "Just hold on." Two B-25s ahead executed rapid S-turns to avoid low-hanging rock outcroppings. Their wingtips passed so close that stone dust trailed behind them. A German gun crew hidden in the rocks opened fire, the flashes lighting up the canyon. Renner pulled slightly to the left. The tracers passed inches from his cockpit glass. The forward gunner returned fire, sending bursts into the rocks. The German crew scattered, their position collapsing under the hail of bullets. They exited the canyon suddenly, bursting into sunlight. Before them lay another valley dotted with German camps and supply posts. Soldiers pointed upward, some dropping their packs, others reaching for rifles. But low-level flying was more than a tactic. It was a shock weapon. There was no warning, no distant drone of engines, no shadows on clouds, only the violent arrival of bombers at rooftop height. In the outskirts of a small village, Renner spotted a German column moving along a dirt road. Trucks, armored cars, and infantry marched in tight formation. The lead vehicle braked, tires locking in panic as the first B-25 swept in low from the east. German officers shouted orders. Some pointed frantically at the incoming aircraft. Others dove behind their vehicles. The B-25s hit them with everything they had. Nose guns shredded the front of the column. Trucks erupted in flames. Dust exploded across the road. Vehicles swerved, crashing into ditches or colliding with each other. Soldiers scattered in all directions. Even Renner felt a moment of disbelief at the devastation. They were not just disrupting supply lines, they were tearing them apart. The German defenders realized too late that altitude, their greatest shield against bombers, had been turned into their greatest weakness. The B-25s flew beneath their guns, beneath their expectations, beneath their doctrine.
A captured German gunner later described the experience to American interrogators. They came at us so low, we did not know if we should fire or duck. Some of us did both. Renner rolled left, guiding the bomber between two hills. The valley behind them was burning. Smoke curled upward in thick black pillars, the ground littered with destroyed equipment and abandoned positions. Harris exhaled. They never stood a chance. Renner did not reply. He knew the truth. They stood a chance. The B-25s just came lower than anyone imagined. And in Italy, altitude was the battlefield, and the Americans now owned the bottom of the sky.
The sun was sinking behind the Italian hills when Lieutenant Jack Renner guided his B-25 back toward friendly territory. The engines vibrated with fatigue, the fuselage scarred, and the wings peppered with holes. Yet the aircraft was still flying, still answering every touch of the controls, still pushing through the final miles of a mission that would be remembered long after the smoke cleared. Behind him, the crew sat in drained silence. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by the heavy weight of exhaustion. Each man replayed the events of the day in his mind, seeing flashes of burning trucks, collapsing bridges, and German troops scattering beneath them. They had flown closer to the ground than any bomber crew should have. They had danced with terrain, dodged power lines, skimmed rooftops, and threaded valleys carved by centuries of wind and rain. And they had survived. But survival was only part of the story. This mission, and others like it, had forged something greater, something that would shape how the aircraft and its crews were remembered long after the war. Renner lowered the throttle slightly as they approached the coastline. "We are almost home," he said quietly. Harris stared out the window. "Feels like we just climbed out of hell." Renner nodded. "We did." The pilot glanced at the empty fields and quiet villages below. The contrast with the chaos they had left behind made the day feel surreal. Smoke still rose faintly in the distance, a reminder of the destruction the B-25s had brought to German supply lines. But here, closer to Allied airfields, the world seemed peaceful. The navigator broke the silence. "Command wants a full report when we land. They want to know exactly how low we were flying." Renner allowed himself a small smile. "Lower than they asked us to. Higher than death would let us." Harris let out a tired laugh. "That sounds about right." The bomber descended over the sea, the reflection of the aircraft shimmering across the water. The waves glimmered in the fading light, rippling with the last hints of evening gold. Renner called out to the crew, "Strap in. Final approach." The Mitchell touched down with a heavy thump, bouncing once before settling onto the runway. Dust billowed out behind it, trailing the aircraft as it rolled to a stop near a row of parked bombers. Some of those aircraft were pristine. Others bore holes and scorch marks, silent testimonies to their own brutal flights. Ground crews rushed toward the bomber, waving and shouting. Their excitement was clear. They had been listening to the radio chatter, hearing the chaos unfold. They knew what the B-25s had done that day. The moment Renner lowered the cockpit window, a crew chief leaned in. "Hell of a run, Lieutenant. We could hear the Germans panicking all the way from here." Renner unstrapped his harness and climbed down the ladder. His legs trembled slightly when his boots hit the ground. Harris joined him, stretching sore muscles. Renner looked back at the bomber. It was a mess. Holes in the wings, scratches along the nose, oil leaking from one engine. The lower fuselage coated with dust and soot. But it still looked powerful, still fierce, still like a predator of the sky. The crew chief followed Renner's gaze. "You know what the infantry boys say when they see you fly that close to the ground?" "What?" Renner asked. He grinned. "They call you the crazy ones, The ones who traded altitude for courage. Renner wiped sweat from his brow. We traded altitude for results. The crew chief nodded. Same thing in the end. Word of the mission spread quickly through the airfield. Pilots and mechanics gathered around the returning crews, eager for every detail. The stories they shared were filled with disbelief and awe. Stories of German soldiers diving into ditches because the B-25s came at them lower than birds. Stories of pilots seeing the fear in enemy eyes as they flew past at full throw. Stories of bridges collapsing in showers of stone just seconds after the bombers passed overhead. Most of all, the stories of how the B-25 Mitchell had become the embodiment of American aggressiveness in Italy. The aircraft itself played a huge role in that legend. The Mitchell was a machine built for close-range, high-speed attacks. Its design allowed it to fly low with stability that heavier bombers could never match. Its forward guns made it as much a strafing platform as a bomber, and its rugged structure gave the crews a chance for fighting, even when flak tore into the wings. But the legend was not only about the aircraft. It was about the men who flew it, the crews who learned to navigate valleys by instinct, the pilots who trusted their machines at altitudes where mistakes were fatal, the gunners who fought enemies only meters below them, the navigators who kept maps steady while the plane bounced through turbulence inches above the treetops. The Italian campaign was filled with dangers: steep valleys, narrow passes, hidden flak guns, rail lines crawling with troops, reinforced bridges guarded around the clock. But the B-25 crews accepted every challenge. They had to, because without them, the German war machine would keep moving. Troops would reinforce the front. Guns would reach Monte Cassino. Supplies would arrive in Rome. Every mission the B-25s flew at low level broke another link in the German defensive chain. As night settled over the airfield, Renner and his crew walked toward the briefing tent for debriefing. The sky above them was quiet now, no longer filled with smoke or fire. But even in the silence, Renner could still hear the echo of the engines, the rush of wind through the valleys, the crack of gunfire beneath their wings. Harris walked beside him, staring down at his boots. You know, Jack, I think today was the first time I understood why they picked us for this. Why? Renner asked. Harris looked up. Because they needed pilots who were not afraid to fly where the enemy thinks we will not. Renner considered it. Not fearless, he said. Just willing. Harris nodded. Yeah, maybe that is the better word. Behind them, ground crews worked late into the night repairing bullet holes and rearming the bombers. The smell of fuel, oil, and hot metal drifted across the field. The sounds of tools clanged under lantern light. The B-25s would fly again in the morning. Low, fast, relentless. And the Germans would once again look up in shock, unable to believe how close these machines dared to come. That was the legacy of the B-25. Not just a bomber, not just a weapon, but a symbol of airborne courage. A reminder that altitude was optional, but bravery was not.